Story 1. I volunteer as an interpreter at a school for the deaf during events. I have worked with the same child for over 2 years, and he recently received hearing aids. I yawned, and he was very surprised because it was quite silent. He imagined it would be an HHH sound. Story 2. Snow. I have a deaf friend who learned that rain and wind make sounds, so she assumed snow would too. She was shocked when we finally had snow and realized it didn't make a sound as it fell. She did appreciate the sound it made when stepping on and crushing it, at least. Story 3. My cousin was one of those people who was absolutely sure the sun would make a sound. He was slightly relieved when he got his hearing aids, walked outside, and it was quiet. Story 4. My uncle is deaf. When he got his hearing aids for the first time, he was shocked and confused that refrigerators make noise. He was also very surprised to realize that trees do not make noise. He knew about wind and that wind made noise in the leaves, but he had thought that trees themselves made noise because he had read Sound of the Trees many times. He said he had expected them to hum or vibrate. Story 5. My sister is deaf and received cochlear implants a few years ago. She is also a jogger. She was very surprised to learn that her breasts do not make bouncing noises when she runs. Story 6. Not completely deaf, just extremely hard of hearing. My older brother had me convinced for almost 40 years that silence was not actually quiet. He kept repeating the phrases, "the sound of silence," and "silence is deafening." And I was firmly convinced that there was no such thing as a moment without noise. When I finally got my hearing aids, I quickly learned what those phrases actually meant, and I felt very foolish. Story 7. I am deaf, and while I have many moments where I think, that makes noise, I do not often experience the opposite. However, recently, I was exploring a printer system and moved something, expecting it to make noise. I asked if it made noise. It did not. I was very confused. I enjoy discovering what makes noise and what does not. The conclusion is that people are living in a very noisy world. Story 8. I always thought butterflies made a fluttery sound when flying. Turns out they are silent little ninjas. Story 9. When I first got hearing aids, I did not realize I had left my oven vent fan on for months at a time. I also did not realize my kitten was so talkative. Story 10. I heard a story where the person did not realize people knocked on the front door. She thought it was magic or incredible luck that someone would be there when her mother opened the door. Story 11. My older brother is deaf. Once he got his hearing aids, he called me freaking out because he had no idea that wind passing through the leaves on trees made noise of any kind. He assumed he was having a problem with the hearing aids, but he was not. It was hilarious having to explain to him what the noise actually was. Story 12. In college, there was a student in my class who had been deaf and received cochlear implants. He was surprised to learn that electric light bulbs do not make noise, as he had assumed they would. Story 13. I am deaf myself. I have been wearing hearing aids since I was 18 months old. Every time I get new hearing aids, I discover sounds I never knew existed. A couple of examples. When I was in my early 20s, I did not know that moving my hair away from my hearing aid made a sound. The wind whistling while driving or my dog's tag hitting the car window. When I was in my mid-20s, I got new hearing aids. I was shocked to discover that air conditioning makes a noise when it starts blowing. I never knew this before. Story 14. My neighbor got an implant in his teens. Someone had previously told him that a fire makes a crackling sound, and for some reason, he assumed that water would make the same sound. Story 15. My sister is deaf and a great lover of cats. One of my favorite things in the whole world is when she grabs my hand to place it on the ribs of a purring cat. I don't know if she knows that a cat's purr can often be heard, and honestly, I am not going to be the one to tell her. The joy she gets from the tactile sensation of a happy animal is absolute joy in its purest form. Story 16. Not a deaf person, and this might be absolutely fake. It is something I read some time ago. There was a deaf man who somehow got his hearing back, and he imagined the sun making noise. Still, it might be completely false, but I think it was an interesting story. Story 17. I have read every single comment at this point, 95 responses, and I believe not one of them actually read what the original poster asked. Remarkable reading comprehension. Reddit, truly exceptional. Story 18. Deaf here since birth. I had the opposite experience. When I got my most recent hearing aids a couple of years ago, I heard myself urinate for the first time. I went over 40 years without realizing that urination makes a sound until that moment. Story 19. I'm not deaf, but I do have hearing loss. I lived with it for a long time before I finally got hearing aids, and I didn't realize how much I was missing. What surprised me most was just how loud the world really is. Everyday sounds I had forgotten or never fully heard before suddenly came alive. For example, when I went for a walk, I was amazed by how many birds were chirping all around me. Even the crunch of gravel under my shoes and the rustle of leaves in the breeze seemed almost overwhelming at first. It made me realize how much my brain had learned to filter out or simply accept as silence. Story 20. I worked in a school for deaf children. One of the teachers had to explain to her class of 10-year-olds that, yes, flatulence makes noise. Story 21. I grew up with two deaf siblings. One of them went deaf at age 13 from scarlet fever, so he knew sounds initially, but after 27 years, he forgot them. He received bilateral cochlear implants after being 97% deaf for 27 years. He didn't know or forgot that cabinets make noises. He opened and closed one squeaky cabinet for 10 minutes. He forgot about birds chirping. One morning, he sat outside in awe of all the sounds made by the birds. After getting the implants, which is a process, it wasn't instant because they had to be tuned for months. It was almost too much to take at first. He would wear them for a few hours, then take them off. He said it sounded like a speak and spell from the 1970s and 1980s at first. After about 6 months, he gained up to 85% word recognition and hearing. I don't think he ever said he thought something made a sound that didn't, but he was able to hear for the first 13 years of his life. It was more that he forgot certain things made sounds because he hadn't dealt with them for so long. Story 22. Not deaf myself, but a deaf friend once told me they were shocked to learn that sunrises do not make sound. They thought that, like in movies, the world plays music when something beautiful happens. Story 23. Not deaf, but worked with a person who was deaf from birth and had schizophrenia. They said they could hear their auditory hallucinations. What does that even mean? It still blows my mind years later. Story 24. When I got married, my former husband's cousin, who is deaf, offered to video the wedding. Sure. He was completely unaware of all the sounds his 2-year-old daughter was making as he held her, standing next to the video camera. Story 25. A friend of mine was deaf and did not know that flatulence made noise until he was in his early 20s. The poor guy had been releasing gas wherever he was, thinking it was silent. Story 26. I remember reading a post years ago about how some boys in junior high told their deaf friend that his body made a sound when he had an erection and that all the girls would hear it. He was very upset. That's pretty messed up, but still funny. Story 27. I have a friend who is deaf but now has cochlear implants. We met up once for coffee, and a minute after we entered the building, there was torrential rain. We went up to the top floor, 2 stories up, and sat for a few minutes chatting. She kept looking around, confused. She then asked what that sound was. Was it the air conditioning or something broken? She had been here before, so she knew what the background sound in this area was normally like. It took me a moment to realize the sound she did not recognize was the torrential rain hitting the flat roof above us. Story 28. I had a friend whose son was deaf. They had a really lovable golden retriever, and the dog and the boy were best friends. When the boy was about 10, he received cochlear implants. One day, the dog barked at a bird or something while they were in the yard. Terrified the boy. He was scared to death and never wanted to be around the dog again. It was really sad because the poor dog didn't understand why his best friend avoided him. They ended up giving the dog to a neighbor. The boy is about 25 now and is still afraid of dogs. Story 29. One of my mother's customers was very embarrassed to realize after getting cochlear implants that people in public restrooms can hear urine hitting the toilet water. Story 30. Wind. I'd appreciate reading about it being described, of course. But until I was about 16 and received a fancy hearing aid that actually worked, I had no idea wind was so noisy. Story 31. Oh, look at all those hearing people answering questions on behalf of deaf people. Actual deaf person here. I pretty much figure everything makes noises. I do remember slapping the back of a halved bell pepper with a knife to get the seeds out and asking my partner, "Is this loud?" He explained that it was the seeds falling out and hitting the sink that made the most noise rather than the knife and pepper. Story 32. I saw a post about a woman who was deaf and had a cat. She did not know that cats make an audible sound when they purr. She described it as a vibration. She got implants and cried when she heard her cat purring. Story 33. I lost a significant portion of my hearing in an accident and lived for many years without hearing aids. I could still hear people talking to me, but much of the background noise was muted. I never bothered to get hearing aids, but eventually my wife became annoyed, and I agreed. The one thing I noticed and took a long time to get used to was the sound of my shoelaces clacking against my shoes as I walked. Because I hadn't heard that sound in so many years, I was very self-conscious about walking at work for a while until several people assured me they never noticed. Story 34. I worked with a deaf man who was a jokester. He would point at random objects, like the little box that squirts soap in the bathroom, and say loudly, "That thing makes too much noise." Story 35. This is not exactly a story about my grandmother not realizing a noise. Instead, she did not realize that the noise of the freight train that ran nights a couple of streets over could be heard very clearly at her house. She has a genetic condition that causes hardening of the central bone of the ear, which made her go mostly deaf as a teenager. She could hear loud sounds nearby, but with talking and such, she was half lip reading and half hearing parts of conversations. When my mother was about 13, she had a new surgery that bridged the first and third ear bones with a wire, bypassing the hardened central bone and restoring her hearing. On her first or second night home, the train went by around 3 in the morning and woke her. She was pulling everyone out of bed, thinking there was a disaster until they explained to her that it was perfectly normal. My mother and her sisters had to adjust. They had gotten used to talking back as soon as she turned away. Suddenly, she could hear them without looking. There were a couple of groundings, I have been told. Story 36. I am a child of deaf adults. My mom got cochlear implants, and one of the funniest things she discovered was that she made noises in public bathrooms. She didn't realize her urine made noise or that her farts echoed so loudly. She was surprised she could hear other people going beside her. She also learned how annoying clocks ticking and dogs' nails clicking on hardwood or tile could be. It takes some time to learn how to tune out sounds when they first get their implants. Story 37. I am deaf with significant and profound hearing loss. The cacophony of birds made me sympathetic to people who complain about the birds as if they are mortally offended at being woken up. I thought, these people are overreacting to gentle twittering. And then I heard how many types of birds scream, squawk, hoot, quack, sound like they are laughing and screech. The first time I heard two magpies fighting, I thought someone was trying to abduct my daughter. They were screaming at each other. I apologized to my husband for calling him a moaning old fart about the birds. Edit. This is the opposite of what you asked for. I misread the question. I will leave it up for anyone interested in deaf people's lives. Story 38. Ages ago, I worked for a telephone relay service for deaf and hearing impaired people. One of the managers was deaf and did not know that flatulence was audible. Story 39. Sadly, I can only think of examples of the opposite. As I age and my hearing aids get more advanced, I have been surprised that many things make noise and I had no idea. Story 40. Trees rubbing together scared me when I got cochlear implants and I was on a hike by myself. Story 41. Oh God. Here is where a deaf person tells you they thought the sun would make a noise. Then I get hideous existential dread imagining the noise the sun should make. Story 42. When I got a new hearing aid with advanced technology, my boyfriend let me listen to some scenes from the movie Saving Private Ryan. Hearing explosions and all those intense new sounds was mind-blowing. Story 43. How many of these answers are legitimate? My uncle is deaf. My cousin is deaf. My brother's aunt is deaf. My sister's dog's owner's second cousin from up the road was deaf. Story 44. Not quite what the original poster was asking for, but I have a story that always makes me laugh when I think of it. It's along the same lines, so I thought I would share anyway. My friend, who is a child of deaf adults, told me this story a long time ago. Her father used to teach the dog tricks like lay down, roll over, play dead, and would give the dog a treat whenever it did the trick. One day, she came home to find her father excited to show her a new trick he had taught the dog. He started signing to the dog to speak. The dog made a motion with its mouth like it was barking but didn't actually make any noise. Her father happily threw the dog a treat. My friend started dying laughing, telling her father that the dog was cheating by just moving its mouth and not actually barking. Story 45. I am partially deaf in both ears and have no treble in my hearing range. The first time I wore the hearing aids, I walked home from the hospital and was very startled. I almost ran in the opposite direction when the pedestrian crossing started beeping loudly. It was the first time I had ever heard it. Edit. I realize this is not what the question is asking. Story 46. It always brings tears to my eyes seeing a deaf person react to hearing sound for the first time. It is a beautiful thing. Story 47. Wind. When I was 4, I had my first ear surgery to get grommets. When I woke up, I kept asking my parents what that noise was. It was the wind through the window. I had never heard it before. Story 48. The poor child was told that his flatulence made noise and everyone could hear it. He became very sad after that. Story 49. Kind of the opposite experience, but I have severe hearing loss and have had it my whole life. I did not learn that insects like bees and flies make sound until I was around 20. I thought the buzzing was just something from cartoons. Sometimes I feel bad for people who can actually hear bugs buzzing. That would freak me out if I suddenly heard something flying in my house. Story 50. My neighbor down the street said she had no idea toilet flushing was not the gentle swoosh she imagined. Story 51. Not deaf, but when I was about 4 or 5 years old, I wondered why I couldn't hear the blinking noises like the ones I heard in cartoons. Story 52. Some of you are misreading original poster's post. What is something you thought made a sound that you then learned did not? You thought it made noise and then learned it is actually silent. Not the other way around. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.